Welcome to Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. An e-zine of the Futures Forum live online. We exchange ideas, information, and inspiration about the futures we want. Get Future Sense Now with host Dr. Claire Nelson, futurist and editor of Human Futures.
Greetings and salutations, and welcome to Future Sense Now, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. February is Black History Month, and we're having conversations on the future history of Black America. Specifically, I'm exploring how Blacks in America might be faring in the years 2030 and beyond, 2040, 2050. I'm focusing on 2030 for two reasons. Number one, United States by 2030 will be a majority minority country and will no longer be the world's sole superpower. And having gone through a bruising election and now stuck in the middle of a COVIDism, as I call it, we recognize 2030 as being two presidential cycles away. But on the global level, 2030 is considered a poll year, with all the nations of the world agreeing that we, the human species, should aspire to achieve 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the goal number 10 focuses on inequality, which I think is probably the mantra or the way of living for Blacks in America. So the central question I'm trying to get to is how might the economic, social, and technological shifts that are happening impact the well-being of the Black community? How might we address this? And so in this episode, I'm speaking to YTASHA WOMACK, as she is a legend in her time. She's an author, filmmaker, journalist, and as she calls it, an innovation architect. I love the sound of it. I think I'm gonna have to probably borrow some of that. I'm probably gonna call myself community development architect. But that's what she is. But more importantly, one of her seminal works, Afrofuturism, the world of black sci-fi and fantasy culture, has become a required text, one could call it. I put required in quotation marks, but certainly seminal text that anybody studying Afrofuturism should read. She's really a leading light in this area, and I'm really grateful that I'm able to sit and talk with her. Also, just want to point out she's working on something very exciting, Bar Star City, book and film transmedia projects. I'm very excited in transmedia projects, given I have my own dream of one. So I'm really excited to also talk to her about that and how she might see our future history. So again, greetings and welcome to Future Sense Now. Miss YTASHA, I'm so pleased to talk to you. How are you?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So we're talking about the future we want. We're starting off in 2030. We're talking about if we make it through COVID without any further more permutations or perturbations, whichever one we want to talk about, is going to be 8 billion people that to be fed and housed and clothed. AI will be ubiquitous if the technophiles have their way. Internet of Things, 400 billion mobile phones, and some people are saying unemployment will be high. Labor unions will find themselves against the wall. And really, technology will be at the heart of everything we do. That image was very much the image before COVID pandemic hit. And I'm wondering, how is this changing? I want you, from your vantage point, as a writer, as a thinker, as an innovation architect, when you think about 2030 and inequality and how that might be pictured from a Black community, given especially the history of the past 4 years, what at first glance do you think we should be thinking about as, advocates and activists to move the needle of disparity in the correct direction?
Right. It's interesting. Sometimes when we think about shifts, we think about shifts in what people are actually doing. And then sometimes there's shifts in thinking. And I think one thing that's become really interesting, aside from looking at inequality issues with respect to access, I think we found that some things that we regard as achievements aren't necessarily achievements. And some things that we call education does not necessarily make everyone informed. And some things that we've also been framed as progress isn't necessarily progress. And so with that, in thinking about Afrofuturism as a lens for resilience, I think it would be really interesting to start looking at communities of color and look at the things they are doing that have facilitated resilience and the unique wellspring and enriched insights that they have based on having been in scenarios that we would call unequal, right? And then look at how that builds character, how that lends itself to creation, how that lends itself to resilience and change and transformation, as compared to communities that in theory have what we would traditionally call access. And I'm saying this because I think that in this period 2020, one of the things that's become incredibly obvious is that there is a lack of knowledge and cross-cultural intersection from a lot of different vantage points. And I think that I'm hoping to have more of a shift in thinking in what we call progress, and a shift in thinking around what we, the basis through which we assess or analyze inequality. Wow. And I'm saying this outside of access.
Yeah, well, first of all, there's so much you have said there that it literally resonated with me in my body. I'm feeling my body starting to tremble. Okay, so let me see if I can pick apart different things that come at me. And let's look at this idea of what it is we call progress. I'm going to start there because as a development practitioner myself, I recall occasionally having flashes of resentment. I'll be in a meeting at the development bank and I'm sitting on and I'm flashes of resentment and I'm thinking to myself, sitting in here, the only Black person, nobody really, cares what I say because they're not seeing the world from my lens. And then I think about coming from Jamaica and remembering an era when we didn't have much, quote unquote, but we could sleep with our doors open, right? And then I say, let us be very clear here. We're talking about economic development. We're socially retrograding, right? And so when I think then about this idea of inequality, and we're at a very inflection point, and yes, COVID, I think, provides some opportunity. One of the things I've been talking about, and it's coming out in my book, is this notion of meaningful metrics and moral metrics. So how might we perhaps begin to have an impact on the Black community leaders that, let's say, in the Black areas where they do control some things? They don't control everything. We don't control almost nothing really. But to the extent we can control our mindset, right? How might we begin to find ways to have conversations about the shift that we have to make as to what progress looks like? Yes, have access is one thing, but to what? To what end?
Right. And I think one of the opportunities and probably even challenges in thinking about progress is the extent to which we measure it around Western, sometimes white Eurocentric ideals, which isn't always bad, but it might not always be in align with things that are, quote unquote, deemed as progress or of value within communities of color. And I kind of think there needs to be an assessment there sometimes. I've seen leaders, just in organizational standpoints, disrupt things that are very core to community in the name of achieving progress. And so, I think that there's sometimes, I guess being people of color in our particular country, I think about the double consciousness concept that W.B. Du Bois talks about. And that could be a it could create a clash, but it can also create a synergy.
Yeah, and for us to find that, I guess, because as you say that, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we do design projects and policies and proposals that undervalue, undervalue, let's say, the cultural thread of what makes things work and click. And we just assume that a nicer building, supposedly, but then that building ends up become rat infested in 5-6 years because it has disrupted some way of being that didn't
Right.
fit with the what would have been considered beauty in that space. You know what I mean? So when I'm hearing you talk about mindset shift, I want to come back to probably your role as a filmmaker. You know, um, how is it then that maybe film and books can begin to create the attention, then forget the mind shift, the attention first to another way of seeing?
Sure. Well, books and films historically have really just shaped a lot of our visual references for what's reality and what isn't, what's possible and what isn't. I would say that a lot of people who are moviegoers probably think they have some understanding of Roman history. But most of what they got from Roman history wasn't through classwork. It's through the images they've seen in film, or to some extent, things that they read in books, which, as you and I know, being students of history, does not always reflect the diversity or the complexity of the Roman Empire. So a lot of our ideas are shaped by images, which is why for a very long time, even now, representation has been a big push for people of color in mediums, and the idea of controlling a narrative and sharing stories. And we're probably at a point now where it's easier for people to create films and books of all kinds and actually get them out because of the distribution systems that we have. It's easier than it was before. If you want to do smaller projects or larger projects or indie projects, and that's a very special thing. Black speculative fiction, Afrofuturism is having a moment. I would say it's probably the beginning of more projects to come, which are really dealing with this sort of imaginary space of, Black people are connecting futures and histories.
So let's go back then to tie this now to say, back to what we're trying to achieve. The conversation I'm trying to explore is about, okay, so we know that this thing could go really awry, right? We know that Internet of Things and AI could be definitely used in a way that's deleterious to our health, right? How might someone like yourself anticipate the role then of our public policy people or elected officials in helping to secure a better future? I mean, I don't know if any of them are reading these kind of books or films, but how might we find ways then to sort of give their staff who are typically young and just fresh out of school, or the young people who are going into these jobs, I don't know, how might we begin to get these just alternative ways of seeing the world out in the space?
Right. Well, I think there's some focus now on looking at, some of these technologies and talking about assessing how they are not recognizing, different skin colors, how they are, a lot of the data collection is in some cases reinforcing biases. There's a lot of conversations where you really have to explain to people that, look, technology in and of itself is not unbiased. It reflects a philosophy. It reflects a thought process and sort of reenacts that. And I think also constant conversations about how technology isn't just AI. It's not just some of the I'll say tech things that we're working with, but technologies are ways of thinking, thinking about race as a technology, thinking about writing as a technology. And these really reflecting thought processes that really dictate how we see something. I think one of the greatest challenges people have is they don't recognize they have a worldview. Yes. And that worldview dictates what they see.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, I'm sort of,
so most of us don't think about how we think.
No, and it can be hard to until you're presented with something which is not aligned with how you think. And that's when you get to interrogate, well, wait a minute, why am I thinking these things? And, sometimes it creates moments of discomfort. But I think it helps all of us to sort of think about that. I mean, one example is, I'm from Chicago. I've spent a lot of my formative years in cities that were either largely Black or highly diverse. That changes my lens on things if I'm looking through everything through this somewhat urban landscape. And just recognizing that, which you would say, well, wouldn't that be a default association? But if I'm looking at media that reinforces that view, then I'm not realizing how urban, and when I say urban, how urban or multicultural some of my experiences are.
Yes.
And
go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, that's really it. And I think we're all in these spaces where you have to say, wait a minute, what's shaping my view based on ethnicity, gender, neighborhood, values, region of the world that you're in? All of these things mean something, but all of us don't get to really interrogate it.
Yeah. Certainly the urban view of America's future is probably different from the view of the heartland, as they say, of America. So we're just the eyes and the feet, not the heart. But as I'm thinking about this idea of AI, what popped into my head was this role that and media, and the fact that we could all create things. That so much of what we've been seeing is fabricated. There's so much overnight sensational things that quote unquote go viral for one reason or another. And we saw recently that it came down to a private sector company being saying cutting the plug, quote unquote, on conversation. I'm thinking about this from two viewpoints, and there may be two questions. How do you think the private sector decision-making choices might emerge in terms of this? When to cut the plug on somebody's speech, right? And then considering that on the Black Lives Matter side, there's some people who call Black Lives Matter a terrorist group as well. There's some people who say that Black Lives Matter is preaching hate. What are you thinking about when you hear these things and you think about the future of the black voice? If we are now subject to perhaps, the same rules that are decided, the metrics against how speech is curtailed, and that these things are done in bots anyway. They go on and they scrub your Facebook page and they decide to not show it or whatever. So what are your thoughts about what's emerging in this way?
Well, I think it says a lot about our reliance on technologies, some of the specific ones that we're utilizing now for communication, and which, isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think it has to be recognized. And I don't know if people are always realizing this, that they are public mediums and public forums, subject to being recorded, subject to being, captured, replayed, listened to, all kinds of things. Yeah. It's not like you and I having a conversation, on a street corner somewhere. And, to the extent that the different technologies we're using are an asset, I also think it behooves us to really think about how public they are and to recognize that, and to and for the moment, there's we're really in a space where there's this idea of controlling narrative. I think that's become more intensified, or at least more obvious. I mean, I think we were always dealing with that, but it's become really interesting where there's this tension around what's the narrative, what really happened, what didn't, what's true, what isn't, what are these histories, what are they not, and the extent to which people can create these realities that are not rooted in the community or relative intersection or respect for humanity. And so it gets to story, but when you realize that different people have vested interest in maintaining certain narratives for any reason, economic reasons, social status reasons, a host of reasons someone can be invested in maintaining a story. I just think that people have to, I guess, do what they've been doing, but which is be flexible.
Do you think that Black media makes any difference, or Black-owned media makes any difference?
Absolutely. Yeah, I came up in Black media. I mean, I started off as a journalist. I was trained in high school to be a reporter at the Chicago Defender, which at the time was a daily Black newspaper. The earliest.
But that word, that Chicago Defender, sounds like a cartoon character right there.
I know. Well, they had one, Bud Billiken. It was like this angelic figure who protected kids. And so I was a youth reporter for them. And then later, after college, wrote for them and, wrote for a number of publications, many of which were Black owned. And so I'm very much attuned to the value of these perspectives. And also the fact that there's the value of these perspectives. There's also the fact that I might not have gotten a break if I hadn't necessarily went through some of these publications. Certainly wouldn't have had the experiences I had. And so
I was about to ask a question, because I'm thinking, that sounds good, but I'm thinking about, at least this question pops into my head because I happened to be on Facebook and something popped up in my feed, which was a love and hip hop episode. And I was appalled, right? So what's the difference then between a Chicago Defender and a love and hip hop? What is that Black owned? Where are the Chicago Defenders of now? Is there I just don't know. Are there any?
Well, I think what you have now is you have a lot of blogs, you have a lot of the Black newspapers, are online. But I think what we may not have to the extent that we want is a strong news source. I see a lot of opinion pieces because they're easier to generate. But having journalists write stories several times a day and do like on the ground reporting requires like a real investment. And I think you have a lot of, and particular skill. You can't just, writing an essay is not writing a news article. There's two different skill sets for that. And I think
Sorry, no, I'm being facetious, but do people actually know that? You think
no, they don't.
Well, they don't know that?
I mean, I think there aren't people who know that because there's journalists know it, but I think there's an excitement about writing in our in this culture that we're all a part of is seen as a validator, right? It's seen as a way of asserting yourself, which is fine. But as a result, now we have a lot of platforms and a lot of people can get their voices out without necessarily being edited, and that can be great and they can be not so great. And I guess my point is just to say that if you want solid news stories from Black perspectives, it's about, training, supporting journalists and mediums and platforms that are invested in telling stories where there's original reporting, not always editorializing and opinions, which are cool. But, that's sort of where we are right now. So I think media, clearly, not just Black media, is really going through this transition space where they're obviously, the days of just solely print and how things are monetized in that way are different. And I'm sort of talking about, I guess, yeah, I'm talking about news here.
Yeah.
Talking about something like Love and Hip Hop. Love and Hip Hop is an entertainment show.
Okay.
You know,
I should not I should
right.
recognize that some people are entertained by the faux drama that's being played out on the screen. But
Right.
I guess it bothers me because I'm thinking about the serious issues that we have to face, and just seeing the minstrel show thing sometimes just gets me very upset. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, about this prison problem, right? And the pipeline to prison, the black pipeline to prison. When you think about that as a writer, as an Afrofuturist, as a innovation architect, right? How might we innovate? Do you think we can innovate ourselves out of this pipeline?
So, I mean, people have been doing it in a lot of ways, right? I mean, in the sense that you do have a lot of programs and supports and, thousands of things trying to on one level, prevent kids from going down a certain path. And what we're also obviously currently addressing is dynamics which encourage or create dynamics where people are going to go down a certain path. So there's an awareness, I think, about it. And clearly Black Lives Matter is dealing with not just brutality, but this whole idea of unfair incarcerations. And I think we're at a point where this has become more of a public conversation. I mean, I remember going back some years ago and you had people like Reverend Jesse Jackson and others talking about incarceration rates, and there was this attitude of, there was sort of I'm thinking about the term, this question of morals, as opposed to a widely accepted analysis around structure. And now we're talking about structure in a way that's obviously, touched people in some ways very deeply, and others it's touched them in ways where they don't quite know how to reconcile how they feel about that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a shift in how we're thinking about a problem. I'm looking at the shifts in how we even talk about addiction, which I think is really rather fascinating. You go back 10, 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's an addict, they're vilified, vilified. And if they're a person of color, subject to higher rates of incarceration. Now we're at a point where we're talking about legalizing certain drugs. And then on top of that, trying to talk about drug use in a more holistic way. And
exhausted, I guess. We're just exhausted trying to fight this war that we don't seem to be winning.
well, I think I would push back on that a little bit.
Okay.
I would push back on that because I think what happens is the landscape's constantly shifting, and it shifts so fast that when there's a victory, we don't always get to jump up and down about the victory because it seems like there's another variation of the problem.
Yeah.
So, all of these well-intentioned things that people have done that has created change has facilitated the change and has facilitated more access for more people that didn't necessarily exist before. So I'm just a person who's always like, hey, we got to recognize the win. You got to recognize the win because
that's true. Sometimes we don't take the time to pause and say, hey, something has shifted. We have gotten all where we want to go, but we did move the needle of thought. What keeps you up at night? What future issues? As a writer, you're in the future all the time. You're like me. You're constantly, journeying and surfing and saying, hey, I'm not so cool about this. What future issues concern you? What keeps you up at night?
What concerns me is people not recognizing the perspectives that they're philosophically shaped into. That bothers me. And the other thing that bothers me is just the lack of knowing history. I mean, granted, I talk about the future, but when I think about Afrofuturism and I talk about it as futures past and present, very much functioning as one. And I I take issue with this constant, how there's a constant attempt to rewrite history, and there's this constant effort to teach history, and then there's this constant effort to just put things in context. So, and oftentimes I'm realizing that many people don't have a basic framework around history, and I'm not talking about Black people, I'm just talking about in general.
Yeah.
So once you get past the relevancy, I mean, obviously you get to years like 2020 and people are like, well, how did we get here? And, that's, if you've kind of been following things, you see how we got there, and you also see patterns, and you also see things that happen. But where's the starting point for that? Those conversations. And what I find is, in sometimes interpersonal conversations, people have these personal narratives, and there becomes sometimes this embarrassment or frustration about histories they didn't know, and then a doubling down on the one or two things that they think they know.
Yeah.
And you have to just keep sort of shifting context, saying, look, everything that happened historically was not a Black or white issue. It wasn't, it's this or it's that. You're good or you're bad. Things shift, and they shift for these reasons. And that's always sort of bothering me, because I want to see a flatness in how people want to think about histories. And if they look at history that way, then that means you're looking at futures in a really singular way. That's problematic.
Yeah, we ask your point. Are you optimistic, or would you describe yourself in general and your writing as, even you might write one thing, but when you look at the future now, look at where we are in 2021, look at the landscape around us and what is emerging in the distant clouds. I have three words: optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic?
Oh, I'm inherently optimistic.
Yeah,
I'm inherently
optimistic. You're working on a new film, I think, Bar Star City.
Yeah.
I want to close with that. How far along are you? And if you can, first of all, what is it set in any particular time?
Well, it's interesting. So it's a couple things that are happening. I just finished writing a graphic novel called Black Cube, and that's a Afrofuturist project, but it deals with two Egyptian gods, and gets a little philosophical, but they kind of come back and seek to reclaim and cultivate lives. And so that's one project that I completed. And then, the Bar Star City project is one that I'm just actively, developing and putting together. I'm moving it more to being like a series at this point than doing the film. And all of my projects, what I'm finding, even Rayla 2212, they really play with time. And I think my interest in doing that is in part to recover histories while simultaneously moving into futures. But I also think it reflects just my experience as a person of color in spaces that feel like layered times to me.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to attribute it to, but there's some spaces I've been in that feel very timeless. I think that there's spaces that Black people create intentionally that are both, they're safe spaces, but they're nostalgic and they're timeless. Well, and you can't tell whether it's 1965 or 2040 based on the decor and the design. But
or at the barber shop.
exactly. You're like, what year is this? Sometimes the conversations, you're like, what year is this? And I think that's really interesting, because to me, it reflects something that's very African diasporic, which is, this constant, Sankofa process of pulling things from a past and interjecting them into a future, but always making it very now.
My closing question is, I want you to pick a future. I would normally tell people 2030, because I'm very focused on the sustainable development goals, and inequality. I know we've gone around and talked about a lot of things, but I know your brain kind of thinks like that. So coming back to where we started, looking out at inequality, and I want you to travel to the future, but I don't want you to go past 2050, right? And
Okay.
2050 is important because 2050 is our climate doomsday year. If we don't sort out ourselves with this climate change, half of us are going to be underwater and burning up. So apart from 2030, we have different like milestones that the clock is ticking.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about the future you want and think about yourself in that future and think about the work that you're doing and the lives you're able to touch and the fact that you're optimistic at heart, I want you to paint a picture and give me a brief headline of a year. Pick a year and just say it's the year, and then tell me what is that aspiration headline of what your films, your books, or just some other things you have done might have accomplished.
Oh, interesting. Wow, this is one of those things I feel like, gee, let me take a break and come back.
I put you on the spot.
Right. What would I say? I would say conceptually, this isn't a title, but I'll give you a concept and maybe I'll walk backwards into a title. Yeah. But I'd like to really think about the level of genius that comes out of what we call troubled neighborhoods, and those spaces being seen as incredible resources, insights and talents that ultimately benefit the world, not just creatively in terms of, all the entertainment and so forth that people create, but also in terms of the thinking processes and people looking to those spaces for future insights on how to create and philosophically, just how to create, how to think, and how to navigate and move forward, because what better spaces when you're thinking about, resilience, adaptability, flexibility, what better spaces to look at than neighborhoods that have been traditionally underserved?
So I'm going to take a stab at it now. This what you said was, beautiful. So if we think about this, by 2030, since I have to come up with something that we can actually accomplish, by 2030, your work as an innovation architect, right, has created a series of microlabs across what people formerly call troubled spaces. And we were able to get support back in 2022 as a result of the Futures of History of Black America project. It allowed us to fund these pocket labs and to really take some of these quote unquote troubled kids and give them a design thinking project to think about how they solve the problem of access to education that mattered to them. Mm-hmm. Because they were asked to create their own educational content. We were able to actually create out of that process about on average, we had about 30 to 50 kids going into not regular colleges, but like short-term things that they could do because they didn't have the attention span to sit in one place for 4 years. But they were doing a string of things. And right now in our program, because it's just 2030, it's only 9 years from now, we have close to 15,000 young people all around this country in our innovation labs in what we now call sun cities. That is my word. That's my version of your story.
That sounds amazing. I'm with you. Because those are, that's where you get, if people have a certain set of resources or feel empowered to sort of build on these things, the stuff they create benefits everyone, and comes from these really unique insights. And I think I would like more people of color, more people who had backgrounds that maybe aren't considered to be traditional, to embrace the perspective that they got in those spaces. Even if, everything wasn't easy, there's a unique perspective, and that perspective is beneficial, I think, in helping to facilitate change, because you're seeing things that other people don't necessarily see. And it's hard to see those perspectives for some people if they haven't been in those spaces, because they don't even know those spaces exist.
Yes.
I mean, there's people in the city of Chicago, I can tell them where I live and they have no idea where that is.
Yes.
That's a problem, right?
Yes.
It's not like I live in an invisible space center at this point. But it says a lot about how socialized we are to go to certain places and not others, based on ethnicity, based on geography, based on whatever. And when I say something like, oh, Senegal was one of the most fashionable places I've ever been to in my life, I have people who look at me like completely, what are you talking about? I've had people who haven't even been to Senegal, better yet Africa, want to argue with me about it. And if I had told them that Paris was the most fashionable place and they've never been to Paris, they would never argue with me about that.
Yes.
So there's these, ideas around where culture comes from, what it looks like, what it means, and a lot of this stuff is just flawed or very problematic. What people consider marginalized.
Yes.
In our traditional circles, I mean, it excludes almost everybody.
Yes. Well, I guess that's a good place to end. We excuse everybody, but we are still here. I want to thank you so much, YTASHA WOMACK, for this very insightful conversation on the future history of America. Your perspective certainly has given me some new things to think about. And just want to say that's it, folks. Thank you for joining us on Future Sense Now, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. Remember, the future is embedded in the landscape of today. So go out and seize the future, create your own, create our future. And until then, next time, safe journeys.
All right, thanks. See you later.
Thank you for listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson. Future Sense Now is produced by the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Remember, our futures are embedded in the landscape of our present stories. Seize the day, share this story, and share the future.